Graham, don't be too nervous.
No,
It's very easy,
I'm
very
not nervous.
painless.
I'm not nervous yet.
Now I get to look over here. The daughter of Abraham and Bessie.
Right.
Yes. See, I have this because I interviewed you back in
But the name is really like Bess.
77.
She called herself Bess.
When did they come to this country?
He's giving me difficult questions.
Oh, approximately.
Can you help me out?
Your father came here about 1897, and he
My
was,
father came here before his bar mitzvah.
I know, and your mother came about.
My mother came here very young too.
Did they meet? Did they meet here?
They met here.
They met in
My
New
mother
York.
came here young too. She was at the tender age of maybe 11 or so.
Did they meet here in New York? They met in New York.
They met in New York City. Yeah, how they met, I really don't know, but it was probably the way most of them met, through people that had come from Europe and
Mhm.
maybe relatives knew somebody, that kind of thing.
They had 2 children.
And they had 2 children, my brother George and I.
Well-
And of course, I was the apple of their eye. I'm kidding.
Of course. Well, let me get the genealogy out of the way so I can.
Right.
George and Belle had a child,
They have one son.
Barry.
Mhm.
Is Barry's single at the moment?
Barry has a child. No, he's married. He has a child that's I think about 6, possibly 6 years old.
Oh, young child.
Yeah.
And then
This is all they have. They don't have any other.
and then the rest of your family I know about very well because
Yeah,
they're
right, we
my
don't.
family.
That's right.
You grew up in New York,
I
in the Bronx.
I was born in the Bronx, New York, and spent about a certain very short time there, really, because I went to Detroit, Michigan. I was still very young, and started. My parents moved to Michigan because my mother had family, that most of her big family lived there, and my mother had hoped they could manage to make a living there. And I stayed there. I was in kindergarten there, and we moved back to New York City after kindergarten. And we lived in New York from the time, I guess I was in possibly the 1st grade till I went through school. And that was
So that year or so.
there was another time in between. There was a time that I was going to Thurkel School, remember? How old would I have been?
That's the same as kindergarten.
No.
Yeah, it was a
Elementary school, but I wasn't in
elementary school.
kindergarten there.
Oh, it's
But I
second
probably
grade.
went to maybe 3rd, 4th grades there, 5th grade.
Do you remember Detroit when you were that little?
Yes.
What kind of place did you live in there?
I lived in a place that was very close to where I finally ended up meeting Seymour.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was just a few blocks away when their family moved.
What
They
area?
weren't living there at the time we were living there, at the first time we were
Uh-huh.
living there. But this was the same neighborhood, because at this time, my mother's sister had moved into that neighborhood. That's Adele's family,
Mhm.
Adele's mother. And we stayed there.
What's-
And I can't remember now. I'm trying to remember. Help me out.
You were living in a house there?
We lived in a sort of a four family house.
Mm-hmm.
And this was after my grandfather had died. The reason we had moved back to Detroit is because my mother's father had died, and my mother couldn't get to Detroit for the funeral because she was a dressmaker and was
Mhm.
making a bridal outfit for the bride and her bridesmaid, and didn't want to disappoint her as to having it on time. So my father went into Detroit for the funeral, and while he was there, he got involved with some of my mother's family, my uncles, and went into business with them. They had him invest. Should I tell them the bad part too?
Tell me everything.
You don't really want to know that, do you?
I want to know everything.
Well, they sort of fleeced him out of his money, but we went there after the money that they had, and we went there because my dad decided, maybe my mother agreed, maybe we should go to Detroit. The family was
Mhm.
there, and it didn't work out.
You were
So
8 years old then. Your Your grandfather died in 24.
Well, that would make it more definite. And then after this experience of losing our money and all, and other people also in the family had lost money. And
What did
one
you-
of my uncles was not exactly kosher, and he was a big builder in Detroit. And he was getting everyone to invest money, and he lost the money for
Oof.
them and never got any of it back for them.
Now, so your family moved back to New
So
York,
my mother and dad and my brother and I moved back to New York.
to the Bronx.
We know.
Where'd you move to?
When we moved back, yes, we moved back to the Bronx, and we lived there a short time, and then my mother was doing well in business, and we moved to Washington Heights, which was Upper Manhattan, which was considered a finer area at the time. And I went through graded school partly in the Bronx and partly in Manhattan, and went through high school in Manhattan, George Washington High School in Upper Manhattan.
So you were living in like a townhouse or flat. What do they call them?
We lived in apartment houses,
Apartment house.
always. This was a New York living, typically.
Yeah. What did your dad do? What did?
My father he was in the cloaks and suits, and right in the heart of the garment industry, and he was an operator worked on a sewing machine, and he was not the big breadwinner, but he did his share. My mother was the one that really supported us, because we
Really?
lived in very nice style. We had a nice apartment.
What did your mother do?
She was in the same business, but she had a shop, and she, most of her, before the Depression, I'm going back, I guess,
That's okay.
and it's in that era, and then things got bad. Nobody was making clothes, nobody was buying furs. His father went bankrupt, and this whole thing shot through, and so it was tough. And she had her brother and family move in. There's a man and a wife and 3 children move in with us in a 2-bedroom apartment, because they had nothing. And considering what we had, it was, we worked together, and the kids went to work. Everybody trying to get a job, as teenagers, and we struggled through it. And that's the way my childhood was, until we got a few back on our feet again, and.
Was this after the
A
after the
lot.
Depression?
Well, it was still Depression when we got married, actually, and because we were married in '34.
Right.
And but when I graduated high school, it was just 32, and that was still Depression. It was a hard time, but we all managed, somehow or other. My mother had gotten some kind of a job in a store doing alteration, which really was beneath the kind of things she could do, And she
But work
didn't
is work.
she didn't see a bright light at that point, but we managed with what we had. At this point, my uncle and his family had managed to move out and move into another apartment of their own, and after that came along my knight on the white horse, and
Well, before you jump ahead, let's jump backwards.
yeah.
Did you know any of your grandparents?
Yes, my father's mother,
That's Ida.
when Ida came to New York from Europe and lived on the east side of New York when she came with my father, who, as I said before, he was bar mitzvahed, and other children also.
Did Ida come with her husband?
Ida came with her husband, and his father and grandfather took ill when he was very young, and he died at a very tender age. I don't think he was 30 when he died. I know he was quite young. And
That's Joseph.
She raised Joseph, and my brother was named after him. In Jewish, he has his name. And she raised quite a few children. I'm trying to remember the grandmother. My father had, let's see, 2 sisters, was it? And he had 3 brothers, I think. There were 3 brothers. I think it was 5 children she raised.
Really?
Her own, yeah.
Did you ever know any of them?
They lived in the same, knew all of them. They lived in the same building when they came from Europe. On the 5th floor, bathroom down the hall, no elevator.
Oh, goodness.
That's right.
Strong legs.
Strong lady, very strong.
Did do you know any of your
Cousins?
well, yeah, your uncles and aunts,
Well,
I
I
guess,
knew
through your
all my
father.
aunts and uncles.
Do you know their names?
I knew, yes, well, let me see. Well, I knew my Aunt Beatrice and my Uncle Joe. Husband was Joe. My Aunt Fay, her husband's name was Nat. My Uncle Bob, her name was Ray. Was my Uncle Bob born here? I think maybe he might have been. I don't remember. But anyway, and then there was a Herman, Uncle Herman, and his wife's name is rather difficult for me to remember. I can't remember her name. I did know it, but I can't think of it offhand.
It's pretty impressive.
But we were close with them, and I even remember when my father's sister Aunt Fay got married. My mother she was the youngest of the family, and she made an engagement party for her at our house because they didn't have a house that was, nice enough, and they lived still in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
And my aunt was marrying a woman who was a Tishman woman. Tishman made these beautiful big buildings.
Oh, right, I've seen the name.
And
actually.
it was her family, so we wanted to make an impression,
Yeah.
So, and he was a lovely man that she married. He was a nice guy, So I remember that very vaguely.
Did you know either of your mother's parents?
My mother's parents, I knew my grandfather and I knew my grandmother.
So
And he knew my grandfather and he knew my grandmother.
Oh, really? So they came to this country and they were around for a
And
while.
they came to this country, now let's see, they must have settled in New York also when they first came, because my mother, did you ever hear about that shirt maker's fire in New York down the east side?
Tell me about it.
Did you remember reading about it? Well, my aunt and Rose, my aunt, Adele's mother and my mother were sisters, and they worked in that Triangle factory that the fire was at. They weren't there at the time of the fire.
Right.
That was the place where
The
they
Triangle Shirt Company.
Yeah, that's it. And they used to take a streetcar all the way from Brooklyn, which was a hell of a ride, to come in downtown and to the east side of New York to go to work.
They had bolted the doors. They had locked the doors, right, to
They
keep
couldn't
all
get
the
out.
employees in.
They couldn't get out. But I always remember that incident, how happy I was that they weren't
Yeah.
there at the time, to think about it.
What's Adele's mother's name?
Rose.
That was
Yeah,
Rose.
she died quite a few years
So
ago.
Rose and Bessie were sisters.
Yes, they were the only two sisters of many brothers.
Really?
That's why they were close.
Were their brothers also in the city?
The brothers were all in Detroit, Michigan,
Oh, really?
and they were all builders.
I see. So that's
Builders.
that's who Abraham met up with when he
That's
went.
right.
Got it. See, it's all becoming clear.
Yeah.
Let's see. So when did you meet Grandpa? How did you meet?
You weren't listening when I was
Oh,
telling
no.
my story.
Well, I do listen, but I forget.
Yeah, it's all right. I was 14 and he was 15, and I used to spend quite a few summers in Detroit, Michigan, after
Mhm.
living in New York, because it was hot in the summer and I was through with school.
It was a vacation.
My mother would send me to my Aunt Rose, and then at the end of the summer, like after 4 or 5 weeks or so, or maybe less, she would come to Detroit for her vacation, and then I'd go home with her. And when I came to Detroit, I stayed with my Aunt Rose, and my cousin Adele and her brothers were all very nice to me. In fact, I shared a room with Adele. I shared her bed with her, and our grandma was in the same room.
That's one.
And it was there was always room for somebody though. They were very gracious people. Nothing was too much for them,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody was welcome. And in fact, we used to go to Detroit for Pesach. We'd go all the way from New York to come because my grandma had a kitchen,
You took the
a
train. I
kosher
assume.
kitchen downstairs in the basement. Was made for my grandmother because she kept a very kosher house, and she had a Pesach ticket. Everything Pesach ticket down in the kitchen that she could cook with. She didn't have to use the other stuff upstairs in the
Mhm.
kitchen. But everything was melchedick and fleischidick, Even the Schwarzer girl my aunt had working for her knew you don't touch anything that you're not supposed to, And it was a wonderful, that part of my life was
Mhm.
very lovely.
So Adele introduced you.
And so Adele had a great group of friends, and there was a boy that lived upstairs. Grandpa was friendly with his father, had a first door, and they lived right down the block, just a block away. And he used to know the boy upstairs. His name was Willard Zamsky, and Willard was, at that time, was my cousin's boyfriend, you know,
Mhm.
so-called. And they were very close. And all the girls and the guys would sort of get together, and my cousin included me in the group. And then all of a sudden, I realized who Seymour Fabrick was.
Oh.
You know, I mean, I may have seen him before, but it didn't open up until then, you know. And that's how. And then we wrote letters like mad for 3 years, 4 years, and we saw each other each summer, you know.
Did Seymour come out to New York ever to visit?
He did come out to New York. He spent his last buck, and he came. Was that when he rode on the Ford? Well, he already went to. No, you came on a bus once, and then you came with the Ford that you drove one. When you came on the bus, were you living in Detroit when you came to see me? I don't remember. You were already in Milwaukee. He left Milwaukee when he was 16 he wanted to come to California.
Mhm.
His boyfriends, the Levinsons, had left for California, and he thought maybe he would come to California. He had saved up enough money, hopefully he'd want to go to law school. And his father went broke, and he gave his father whatever monies he had accumulated, and he thought he would go and try to reach his friends, maybe they
Mhm.
could get together or something. But he stopped in Milwaukee because his uncle had a shoe factory, and he thought maybe he could give him a job and he could make a few bucks before and this is exactly what he had planned. But he got stuck in the shoe business, which wasn't harmful to him really, and
Ultimately not.
and he had a cousin that I had met, his cousin, and she got married, and she came to New York to go on her honeymoon. They were going to Europe. She and her husband. His uncle was quite wealthy, and we were very friendly. We saw her off on the ship. You know, he wasn't there, but we saw her off because we felt there was nobody in New York to see her off. And when she came back, they had an apartment and all, and she wanted me to spend my next vacation with them so I could see Seymour, you know, because he was
Mhm.
living in Milwaukee. And that's how it really, you know, went. And then all of a sudden he decided I shouldn't go home to New York, that we should get married.
That quick?
Oh, yeah.
When you decided that you were going to get married, did it take a long time to plan the wedding and have it, or
We
was it?
didn't have a wedding.
Oh, that's right. You were a
We
rabbi
went to
study.
the
I
rabbi
remember.
house. But your grandfather, I don't usually talk this nicely about him in front of him, but he told me that if the right thing to do, he said, would probably be to go back to New York and let your mother make you a wedding, and she would steal to make, after all, I was going to be a bride. It was not her only daughter, her
Right.
youngest child, of two children, and he felt they couldn't afford to do that. They'd get themselves in debt, and it wouldn't be
Yeah.
right, and she'd be very upset if she couldn't make me a bride. And then also his parents couldn't afford to come to New York, the traveling and all, we were staying in a hotel or whatever. So I agreed with him. I knew he was right, and we called our parents and we told them that we're going to get married. He got on to explain why he felt it was right, and my mother said she understood it. It was very hard for her, but she
Mhm.
said she did understand it was probably the right thing to do. And my father was mad at him. He was never a person to get real mad, but he was mad at him, you know, and he said, oh, I knew you were going to take my daughter and be married, and he really liked him very much. He did. It ended up they liked him better than they liked me, you know. So, but that was the way we got married, and that's the only thing that bothered me. But my mother was very understanding. She said it was a very sensible thing to do.
Mm.
She came to see us, and he came. You know, we managed to get to see each other. So.
Did you like Milwaukee?
Pardon?
Did you like Milwaukee?
No, I hated it.
Cold?
Well, it wasn't only cold. It's just that I think it was his family, with all due respect, this aunt and uncle were not very cordial to me. The one whose daughter was so nice to me.
Yeah.
I was like somebody had picked them on the street as far as they was concerned. They were concerned, and they resented his marrying me, and they really were not his keepers. I mean, they shouldn't, have had anything to say about it, but this is the way they felt, and they weren't very nice. However, I was very fortunate. I made some very nice friends there. We made some very nice friends there. So it took a little while. I remember I had gone back to New York about 6 months or 7. It was in February. We married at the end of June. My mother had a 25th wedding anniversary, and I thought I should go back. And I went back home, and I thought, I was so miserable in Milwaukee. And we were living with a very nice couple. They were distant cousins of Seymour's. She was, and they rented a room. And they had a 2-bedroom house, and they were very nice to us. But I was 18 years old, and they were quite a few years older. They were more set in their way, and I guess I just wasn't very happy. So he says, "Why don't you go home for that? That will make a difference." And he was right. I saw that now that I was married, it was a different thing. I couldn't just go back if I wanted to with the same friends and all. It was different. They were living different lives already.
Things.
Everything changes. So that was the way. And then we decided I made the best of it, and I was lucky. I did have some wonderful friends, and we had some wonderful times there.
Were you in an apartment?
At first we lived in after we left Edith and Frank, where we lived in their little house, there was an apartment close. It was difficult to get apartments at that time, and particularly when we rang one bell, and there was a sign on it, "No Jews allowed." I never saw that in my life.
Not coming from the Bronx.
Couldn't believe it.
Or Manhattan,
That's right. And I was so shook up. So anyway, we found this little apartment that was very nice. It was a 2-story apartment, maybe I think 8 units or something, and not too old. It was fairly nice, and also his factory, the shoe factory, had moved out of town, which was 50 miles north of where we lived, and this was right on the highway practically to go. So I thought it's perfect because he doesn't have to go through town to get out. And we applied for it, and we got the apartment. And right after we get the apartment, some gal was talking. She said, that apartment, they hate Jews. That's all I had to hear after. So I was so upset. And it turned out that they had what they call not a superintendent. What do they call them?
The manager.
Like a manager. And they lived right on the apartment, a couple, a German couple. But then most people were German all around us, And they were very nice to us, and I let them know an occasion came up where I could let them know. I wanted them to know we were Jewish. I didn't want anything to be said that I would be upset or they would be upset. I wanted them to know. And she said, "You're Jewish?" She says, "Are you both Jewish?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "I thought maybe one of you were." And nothing ever happened. I mean, nothing. Yeah. And when I had the baby, I had Howard and your dad in that apartment. There were no wash machines and stuff. You had to boil diapers, no diaper service. And she used to help my mother. My mother came in town to boil the diapers down. She was as nice as could be to us. I mean, you can't listen to everything everybody tells you,
No.
Sometimes it takes people, to be disliked, not the fact that you're Jewish, But anyway, it was a good beginning. We enjoyed our apartment, and then we moved into a duplex. It was sort of new, and did we live upstairs first?
No.
We lived upstairs first, and we had a nice couple downstairs. There were a young doctor and his wife and a little baby girl. And then they moved out, and we moved downstairs. And we had German neighbors on both sides, and there was a German couple. He owned one of the biggest hardware stores in Milwaukee, and they had no children. And he was a selfish. He never spent a penny. And his wife fell in love with us, and she said, if I ever had it to do over again, I'd marry a Jewish man. She liked the fact of the Jewish husband, It was really cute.
And when did you decide to move to California?
When did we decide? Before Carolyn was born, I know that. Let's see. When was that?
So you were married, what year were you married?
34.
34.
Decided to move in 1940.
Because we came here before Pearl Harbor.
Carolyn, you were pregnant with Carolyn, so we decided to wait.
Because she was cesarean, and I didn't
really?
want to change.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't want to change doctors. They were both cesarean.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, now you're finding out.
Oh.
And we decided that it'd be best if we waited until after we had, which we did, and it worked out fine.
And then you have to recover from the surgery and all.
Well,
So when did you
it
finally
wasn't,
move?
well, Carolyn was exactly 3 months old,
Uh-huh.
and your dad was 3 years old when we got into California.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you took the train.
I took the train.
What was that
I
like?
took the train with the children. He didn't come with us, and I had my little Polish gal. She was the blessing. She came to work for me at
Mhm.
$4 a week. We believe that, and that was considered going wages.
Wow.
And she was so wonderful.
She started working for you in Milwaukee.
Mhm.
And she moved with you out here?
We taught her. Her father gave us permission. She came from a farm up northern Wisconsin, and she was one of many children. And they were Polish people, Polish family, very strict
Mhm.
Catholic. And I spoke to her father on the phone, and I wrote him a letter, and I said we would be responsible for her, and if she wanted to come home or you wanted her home, we would take care of that, just so she could take us over the hard part. And he agreed to let her go, and she was thrilled. She didn't want to go home, but it was time really for her to go back. How long did Lucille stay with us? About a year?
Just
Year
a
and a
little
half?
over a year.
Probably almost a year and a half maybe. But she was a godsend, yeah.
Where did you live when you first
On 4th Street. Well, when we first got here, my mother and dad were already here. My
Mhm.
mother and dad came here the year after we were married. He had to come here because he wasn't well, and they suggested the milder climate. And she was living in Hollywood. And what would you call this little place she lived
Court.
in? It was like a court, and there were little houses in this court, and she lived in one of them. And when we were coming out, of course, she was so excited to bring 2 grandchildren. We were going to
Yeah.
be here with her. And she rented one of the little bungalows for us. She had chicken soup on the stove. She had milk in the refrigerator, and a crib set up. And you can imagine what went on. She was so excited. She came right down to that train, and met us. She was excited. So I never saw anybody so excited in my life. And she got permission so she could come down and help us, with the baby and all the
Mhm.
equipment and stuff. And what a thrill that was. That was the nicest thing that we could ever do for my mother and father.
Was the train ride
Was our
rough?
time. It was, nobody knew there was a baby on the train.
Uh-huh.
We had 2 bedrooms. He sent us in first class style right next to each other. They opened up, and she slept in one with the baby, and I slept with Howard in the other. And when we got off the train, the people in the next compartment to her looked at us and they said, "Was that baby on this train all the time?" They couldn't believe it.
Hidden in your purse, yeah.
She slept the complete trip. It was unbelievable, except to eat and go to sleep again.
God, you got lucky.
Yeah, it was just, and Howard was very good. He was a very good traveler, always.
Well, 3-year-old, he must have been fascinated by being on the train and must have loved it.
Oh, yeah, it was very exciting for him. At that age, he observed everything. He was very, we took Howard had been to California before. When he
Okay.
was a year old, I took him
Ah.
to see my mother and father, and we visited the same court. And then we took him back on the train. You came out to get us, I think. We went back on the train. My first visit to California with Howard. I don't remember. And anyway, Jack Benny was in the club car.
Mhm.
And you don't remember this incident?
Well, we went back east.
That's what I'm talking about, yeah. And he was crawling around on the floor, and he opened Jack Benny's shoelaces. And Jack Benny was very funny. He made a crack, so it was really cute. So it was quite exciting for us,
It is.
but
When did you move from the court
we,
apartment?
when
what-
did we move from the
Actually,
court?
not when. What did you move? What was your next step? Where
Our
did you go
next
to
step
next?
was we moved to
4th Street.
4th Street, a block west of Fairfax, corner of
Oh, yeah.
Edinburgh and almost the corner. And there was a school on the corner, and it was a convenient, though they didn't end up going to that school. The school was not, it was on a new progressive kind of a program, and it just didn't work out. And so we put them in another school that was down on 3rd Street.
Elementary school.
Yeah, and it worked out fine.
Hmm.
But it was a good life. And I remember one day after living there quite a few years, our owner of our building, our duplex, we had a lovely dentist and his wife living downstairs, Dr. Dorshkin, and they were just darling people. They had a little boy, and our owner lived across the street, and he was. I don't know how it all came about, whether he moved out or when he was in service.
Well, the owner across the street wanted to sell the.
I know, but were the Dawsons still living there? I don't
Sure,
remember.
they were living there, and he went into service,
Yeah,
and I bought the house.
because when you came home one day, I heard that he was gonna sell the house, and I said to you, we gotta buy this house, I'm not moving.
Right.
So we didn't have any money. He looked at me like I was crazy.
Beats buying it. I mean, beats moving again. That's horrible.
Well, I couldn't see moving because first of all, the houses were at a premium, rentals were impossible. So I was like this,
Mhm.
So somehow or other he managed. We bought the house, and we should have bought all the houses on the street.
Had
but
Seymour
what do we know?
had Seymour started the factory yet?
That's what on the shoestrings thing.
Mhm.
So it was pretty difficult. We had no money really,
Right.
but it was all for the maneuvering and.
Now
figuring out.
you weren't working at all by the time you got here.
Well, that
you
was
weren't
the
working.
stipulation when I married him. I don't work,
Mhm.
like some people don't do windows,
Yeah.
I don't work.
Now you had worked as a secretary, or what had you done
No.
in New York?
I
or
had
Detroit?
worked, I was in I did secretarial work, but I also worked the switchboard and all in a car agency, Plymouth Dodge and Chrysler,
Mhm.
Plymouth and Dodge agency. And then I worked for a very short time at an auction house down right near Wall Street, where
Mhm.
they auction things off. And I enjoyed that. That was fun. The other I was a little more nervous about. Yeah.
When did you move into the house at Hillcrest in Elevado?
Well, 1950, June 6th, 1950.
How did you swing that? That must have been quite a purchase.
Well, we bought a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and we were convinced that it was the greatest lot available in Beverly Hills, and I thought the price was unbelievable. I thought, what are we, crazy? And he did too, until we found out it was a steal. It was
Can I
a
ask
corner lot in the heart of Beverly Hills.
what was it at that time? I'm just curious.
$20,000.
Oh my God. And my guess is, what would it sell for today?
No way of knowing.
Who knows?
Of course, even with the market down, there's no way of knowing.
Amazing.
Yeah,
And so you built that house.
we built the house.
That was an
I
incredible
built the house with his money. It was a great house. We loved our house very much.
Now I heard Abraham lived with you. Your father lived with you there in the guest house in the back.
He didn't live there with us until after my mother died,
Mm-hmm.
and that was my mother died
56?
66.
No, 56.
56.
56, and then 5 years later, he lived with us for 5 years, and 5 years later he died. And that was he lived in our guest house.
I remember that house well.
Do you really? I wondered about that.
I really do. I remember.
It was a great
Well,
house.
it was because it had so many innovations. You had everything. You had a soda fountain.
It was a.
You had a
we-
remote control
us-
television
and
set.
and we had
no one else
everything at
did.
the right time. The kids were growing up. I mean, it seemed to me everything seemed to be just the right.
I
time.
heard about a car that you owned all through the 50s.
We had a handmade Lincoln Mark II that was handmade. It was like they made only a certain number of these cars, and it was like what's a classic.
Mm-hmm.
But who could afford to keep it for all these years to be a classic?
Right.
We have to keep it up. So, but it was a great car. I love that car, and so did everybody else.
Now, did that car? I remember a car that you drove that had a remote control garage door opener. When no one else in the world did, as far as I knew. You had a remote control garage door.
Did we have
Was
that?
that car?
Did we have that in
Yeah,
that?
in that Lincoln.
Yeah, because I had that the longest of all
Mhm.
cars that I had, probably, yeah.
That was an amazing house. I remember all the birthday parties in
Yeah,
the
we had,
backyard.
it was a fun house, and the kids had a good house, we had a good house, we entertained a lot in it, you know, it was a good house for easy entertainment, or if we wanna make it fancy, we had what we wanted, you know, it was really a perfect house for it to live in.
And your best friends across the street
The
as it
Owens
turned out.
lived there, yeah, and still live there,
Still do, don't they?
yeah.
You must see the old house when you go and visit.
Pardon?
You must see the old, you just see the old house every time you go and visit. Do you see the
Yeah.
Owenses a lot?
Yeah, well, they've redone, we don't see them that much socially anymore,
Mhm.
but the house has been completely redone, and, but they've done it beautifully, it's
Really?
a very fine house, it's not a pottery house, it's
No?
done with real good taste, very classic taste, you know.
Oh, I loved
And
it.
not a bunch of velvets and crystals and all that kind of stuff, it's done very livable and very beautiful. It's an old house, but it's in A1 condition.
I live in an older house.
Yeah.
Believe me.
Yeah, but it's done beautifully and very, very warm, very warm.
That Sam wants you to call it.
Oh, does that sound?
Was that Sam, honey? Oh.
She's pretty resourceful. Knows where to find me at
Uh-huh.
any given
I can see
given
she's
moment.
on the ball, yeah.
What else do we need to talk about, Graham?
I don't
Any
know.
any interesting stories?
Probably
Thoughts?
haven't met any of them, but I don't think we have all that time.
We're doing pretty well.
Did you know that I was in yes you do, know that I was in a railroad crash? In a.
Tell me about it. I
A couple of people.
vaguely remember.
Engineer and a fireman were killed on the Southern Pacific Railroad. My first trip to visit my parents in California.
Where was it again? I remember
It
this.
was the year after I was married, 1935.
And you were coming out.
I was coming to see my mother and dad, and we were in Tucumcari, New Mexico,
Right.
and there was a switch thing, you know, what do you call it, railroad switch, and somebody switched it incorrectly, and we smashed into a freight train, and our car was turned over completely, and there were people, the fireman and the engineer were killed immediately, and there were people hurt and stuff, and it was a pretty horrible thing. And we were in the middle of nowhere in the day. I didn't even know we were on the borderline of Mexico. I had no idea we were that close.
Yeah.
And I was in a daze, and being very young, I mean, I didn't know what to do, but I was only worried about him, which sounds silly now. But I was concerned that, first of all, my mother and dad were expecting me in Los Angeles, and I was worried, what are they going to tell them at the other end?
Yeah.
And then he was going to St. Louis for something,
I was in St. Louis.
you were in St. Louis. I knew exactly where he was in
Uh-huh.
St. Louis. And so I said to one of the men that were walking there, you know, I said, is there any civilization here where I could get to a telephone? You know, it sounded almost impossible. We didn't have telephones on the train
No.
then, you know.
No.
And he said, well, there's a little switch house down the way, you know, they didn't call them switch house, whatever they call them. And if you can, he says, if you can borrow a flashlight, you can walk the tracks and you'll go right to it. He didn't tell me how dangerous it could be. I mean, I had no idea. You know, I was in a daze, you know. It's the middle of the night. You know,
Right,
it's like
right.
2, 3 in the morning. And so there I am, walking with the flashlight along the track.
Oh my God.
And I walked in, I don't know how far it was. It seemed forever. And I finally saw some lights, and there was this place, and there was a woman in there with a baby in a little basket. And she was the one that was going like this with the track, and it was one of those old-fashioned phones
Oh my
where you
God.
gotta go like this.
Oh my God.
And I told her what happened. She didn't even know there was a train wreck down the way. This is what threw me completely.
Oh my God.
And I guess maybe it was a different switch or something. And I told her I was trying to reach my husband in St. Louis, and is it possible to use that phone? I said, I can, I'll pay for it, or however you want. I don't know how it worked out. You know, I was afraid you thought maybe I wanted
Right.
it for nothing or something. And she says, oh, I can get it for you. And she did this, and then she found out, you know, how to reach St. Louis and all that. And I did reach you, didn't I? Yeah. I got him. And and he, of course, called my mother and dad, so they would be reassured no matter what they heard that I was okay, because, you can't go by if it's in the paper what goes on. Sometimes
How did they get you out of that mess?
well, we had to wait there for, I think it was like 12 to 14 hours before another train could come along that was able to pick us up and be on another track
Uh-huh.
and to be able to take us into Los Angeles.
Wow.
It was really kind of different. Then it got hot. First, at night it was freezing. I thought I was going to freeze to death. And then all of a sudden it was so hot, when the daylight broke.
Thank God it didn't happen a couple years later when you were traveling with the kids.
Yeah, well, that's right. But anyway, it was an experience I could live without. But it was really very upsetting. But but it worked out okay for me anyway. I was okay. And when I got into California, I said to my mother, I never expected to arrive like this, with this kind of a problem. And they were so happy to see me, of course. But that was one of those experiences in life. We had a few other things that turned out okay that we were worried about. I was worried about.
Let me ask you something that I'm interested in. What was it? Tell me what it was like to deal with Howard when he came down with polio. Tell me about that whole.
Well, it was. We have two versions of that story. We were just talking about that.
Well, tell me your version. I'll get Seymour's later.
I was under the impression that it was during the summer of the worst polio siege ever.
Yeah.
And your father had just graduated Beverly High, and he was, no, I got it wrong. He just graduated at Hawthorne, and he was going into the 9th grade, and he was already accepted to go on the football team. He was perfect, as far as they was concerned, terrific potential for football. And I was under the impression they had already started in the heat the training for football. Usually is in the summertime, with the helmets and with all the crap. And he came home. I remember seeing him come home with all this stuff on him, and he was sweating and all that. And he did that a few times while they were training. And then every summer we would have these people from Chicago and other people from New York that would come out for their vacation in California. They were connected with the shoe business, and Grandpa did business with them, and we entertained them at the pool. We had a whole day, like barbecue and swimming and all that stuff, and drinks and whatever. And they had children with them, and it was a nice day. And Howard and Carolyn always participated, and they were friendly with their children too. There were some younger ones and some older ones. And somehow or other, it seemed to me this was on a Sunday, and Howard, who normally participated in these things, I think he may have gone for some practice of some sort in the morning. And he came in and he said he was tired and exhausted, and he looked like he was very sweaty and all. And so he said he'll take a shower and he'll lie down, and then he'll come out and he'll join the whatever. So I said, it's fine. Well, he never came out, and this is the way I remember it. And when I went back in, he wasn't feeling well. He said he was very hot and very cold, very hot. So I gave him something for his head, I gave him some, at that time everything was aspirin. And I told him to stay in bed, and I put light covers on him so he wouldn't be too warm. And I kept going back and forth, and I was worried. I didn't know exactly why he was reacting that way. And he never was as much as a crutch as he is now, to put it mildly. But at that time he had a reason to be a crutch, and I didn't know, of course. And then towards the end of the day, when everybody was going home, I knew there was something wrong, and of course, I felt that Seymour felt the same way I did, and this is my version. The first thing in the morning, he went with him to the doctor. He took him right to the doctor. He was also putting time in the shoe factory. He was working in one of the factories, trying to spend a few hours a day or something. When Seymour would go down, he'd take him with him. And so that morning, though, they went right to the doctor in the morning, and they came home very early, and uh, Seymour says, see that he gets in bed, and I'll put him in bed, and I'll talk to you. And when I put him in bed, Howard says to me, let's see, what did he tell me? He said he wanted to, I said, what'd the doctor say? He said, I'll be okay. You know, it's just takes time. My system is all run down or something like that, he told me. And he still didn't say anything because I was taking care of Howard. And then he said, we didn't have this Encyclopedia Britannica. We had something else. What did we have? The World Book or something, or one of the other books. And he says, get me the book with the P on it.
Mm-hmm.
I says, Howard, it isn't under polio. It's under, infantile paralysis. He said, how do you know what I'm talking about? And that's how I remember it. And he says, is that what they told you? He says, well, it was just, they think it might be that. Then he thought it was scaring me. So I went and I discussed it with Seymour, and he told me it definitely was that, but he was over the worst, according to the doctor. But there were things they had to keep working on to make sure he wasn't going to be left with any problems, and he had to be treated that way. And then we started going to the beach. Cabot Kaiser had this place at the beach, and we were going 3 times a week for treatments, and he was, and we were so blessed when we saw what was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
It was the most horrible sight in the world. They were bringing in young kids in the ambulance by the dozens. That's how bad the epidemic was to this place. It was a horrible thing.
How is it that he never needed to be, he was never put in a ward?
He wasn't an inpatient, he was an outpatient.
So he was past the infection?
He passed the infectious stage. He had been infectious, but it passed over without our knowing.
And and Carolyn never was affected?
No.
Wow.
I say we were very lucky.
I was just reading an article about somebody
and he was very lucky.
There was an article in the LA Times a couple weeks ago about somebody who still is alive from the same epidemic who lives in an iron lung.
That's right.
A very scary story.
There's quite a few that they're still, they can't use their legs, they can't use a lot of things because of that epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a few walking around.
And then he went on to become a swimmer?
And, well, that's what brought him into swimming.
Mm-hmm. That was part of his rehab?
That's right. And that saved his life. He didn't have any, the only thing is that after a while he was having some sort of a weakness in his back, which eventually seemed to have straightened down a little bit. I think maybe he has recurrences, but then everybody has backache, you don't really know. But he was very fortunate, and so were we.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a terrible time for us. It was very distressing, And, but as long as the end is good, that's an important thing.
Now I have one of those questions for you in closing here. That you're probably not going to be able to come up with a good answer to on the spot because it's one of those all-encompassing questions.
Okay.
But if your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren might be watching this tape 50 years from now.
Poor kids.
I know, but they might just be watching this. Is there any experiences or any thoughts from your life that you'd like to share with them?
It is a tough question.
Yeah, I don't know that I could answer it.
I don't know if I can answer it.
No, you don't have to.
All I know is what I wish all of those children that might be coming in the future, and I wish them good health, I wish them good luck, and I wish they have the same situations in marriage that I have had and meet the most wonderful person in the world to share their lives with. That's all.
Thank you, Grandma. Conversation. You gotta just kind of look at me and
5 after.
yeah, I'm trying to set my little timer, but I forgot how to work it.
That's good.
I know.
That always helps.
Now, who the heck are you? Seymour Clarence
Seymour Clarence Fabrick.
from Brooklyn.
Right.
I've met you before.